In a quiet town where secrets never stay buried, a father's protective love turns into deadly rage when he discovers his daughter's forbidden affair with his sworn enemy's son. Love, loyalty, and vengeance collide in a moment that will shatter lives forever. One of the most respected men in Millhaven was William Parker. A tall, imposing figure, William was known for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to his family. His reputation was built on strength, but there was a darker side, an unforgiving nature, especially when it came to those who wronged him. Yet to his daughter Emily, he was a different man, protective, caring, someone who would do anything to ensure her happiness and safety. Emily was William's pride and joy, a beautiful young woman full of kindness and warmth. Loved by everyone in town, she often helped her neighbors, volunteered at the local community center, and spent time with her friends. But what the town didn't know was that Emily carried a secret, one that would soon shatter the carefully constructed life her father had built for her. Beneath William's respectable image was a bitter enemy, Thomas Greer. Years ago, a deep rift had formed between William and Thomas, sparked by personal betrayal. This rivalry had festered for years, growing into a deep hatred. To William, Thomas embodied everything that had gone wrong in his life, and their feud had become a defining part of his identity. What William didn't know, however, was that Thomas had slowly found a way back into his life, through Emily. For months, Emily had been secretly seeing Thomas's son, Michael. Their relationship had grown in quiet moments, hidden from the judgmental eyes of the town, and most importantly, from her father. Emily knew what her father's reaction would be if he ever found out. His hatred for the Greers ran deep, and his pride was unyielding. Emily and Michael met by chance, far from Millhaven. What began as innocent conversations soon developed into something more, a love that felt pure, untouched by the bitterness between their families. Despite knowing the consequences, Emily couldn't stop herself. She was in love, and no feud could erase that. For months, they carried on their affair in secret, meeting in hidden places, stolen moments that kept their love alive. Emily felt torn, knowing how much her relationship with Michael would hurt her father. Still, her feelings for Michael were undeniable, and she couldn't let him go. But secrets in a small town rarely stay hidden. Rumors began to swirl, whispers about Emily's late-night absences and her growing distance from William. Though consumed by work and ongoing tensions with Thomas, William couldn't ignore the subtle changes in his daughter's behavior. At first, it was easy to dismiss, her reluctance to talk about her day, her quick responses to his questions. But over time, the signs became too obvious. William's suspicions grew, and though he didn't know the truth, he felt something was wrong. He could sense it, but the depth of the betrayal would be beyond what he could imagine. One fateful evening, William returned home from a long day, his mind clouded with the usual worries. His disputes with Thomas Greer, the pressure of maintaining his standing in the town. He hadn't seen Emily all day, and though this wasn't entirely unusual, a gnawing feeling unsettled him. Something felt off, as if the balance in his life had shifted, and it wasn't just his usual concerns weighing him down. As he walked through the house, he noticed Emily's phone lying on the kitchen table, unlocked and abandoned. Normally, William respected her privacy, but tonight his unease got the better of him. Driven by the tension that had been building for weeks, he picked it up. What he saw froze him in place. There on the screen was a message from Michael Greer. The words were affectionate, intimate, unmistakable evidence of a relationship far deeper than casual friendship. William's heart pounded as the realization hit him. Emily, his daughter, had betrayed him with the son of the man he despised most. Rage surged through him, his mind spinning as he scrolled through the messages, piecing together the truth. Emily had been seeing Michael for months, right under his nose. Every late-night outing, every whispered phone call, every moment she had evaded his questions. It all made sense now. She had lied to him, betrayed his trust, and worst of all, she had chosen the family that had brought him nothing but pain. William's anger wasn't just about the romance. It was deeper, rooted in the history between their families, in the betrayal that had festered for years. To him, this wasn't simply a forbidden love. It was a deliberate rebellion against everything he had worked to protect. He had been blind to it, and now the truth was like a knife in his gut. For a fleeting moment, William considered confronting Emily right away, but something inside him snapped. The years of bitterness, the anger toward Thomas, and now the discovery of his daughter's deception. Everything boiled over. Reason gave way to a fury he couldn't control. He couldn't let this stand. Emily had made her choice, and in doing so, she had chosen her fate. Storming out of the house, William's mind clouded with rage, driven by the need for confrontation. In his heart, the final remnants of calm slipped away, replaced by an unstoppable force of anger that would forever mark the darkest chapter of his life. The evening air was crisp and cold as William stormed outside, his footsteps heavy with purpose. His thoughts spiraled out of control, his mind consumed by the image of Emily and Michael together, her betrayal playing over and over in his head like a relentless echo. Every step he took seemed to fuel the rage burning inside him, pushing him closer to an inevitable confrontation. He knew where they would be. It was the place where they had likely met in secret, a secluded path by the river, hidden by the tall trees and overgrown brush. William hadn't thought about that spot in years, a place from his youth where he had once sought peace. But now it was the place where his daughter had gone to defy him, to be with the son of his sworn enemy. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the familiar clearing. He wasn't thinking about what he would say or how he would confront her. He wasn't thinking at all. All that consumed him was the fury, the betrayal, and the overwhelming need to put an end to what he saw as a violation of everything he had built. And then he saw them. Emily and Michael stood close together, their heads bent in quiet conversation, oblivious to the world around them. To anyone else, it might have been a tender scene, a young couple sharing a stolen moment of intimacy, but to William it was a cruel betrayal, a sight that twisted the knife deeper into his heart. Without thinking, William charged forward, his voice exploding into the quiet night. "Emily!" The sound of his voice shattered the moment. Emily's eyes widened in fear as she turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. Michael instinctively moved in front of her, shielding her from the anger that radiated from William like heat from a fire. "What are you doing here?" Emily stammered, her voice trembling. But William wasn't listening. His eyes had already moved past her, locking onto Michael with a hatred that was impossible to contain. "You!" William spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can come into my family, into my life, after everything your father has done? You think I'll let this happen?" Michael, to his credit, stood his ground. His voice was calm, measured as he tried to defuse the situation. "Mr. Parker, this isn't about our families. Emily and I—" "Shut up!" William's voice was nearly a scream, the fury consuming him. He couldn't hear reason, couldn't see anything beyond the betrayal that had taken root in his soul. "You and your family have done nothing but destroy everything I care about, and now you've turned my daughter against me." "Dad, stop!" Emily cried, stepping between them, her hands raised in a desperate attempt to calm him. "This isn't what you think. Please, just listen." But William couldn't listen. His mind was a storm of rage and hurt, his vision blurred by the betrayal he felt from his own daughter. How could she do this? How could she side with the enemy? "How could you do this to me, Emily?" His voice broke as he turned on her, the hurt in his words cutting deeper than any blow. "I raised you better than this. You were supposed to trust me, to stand by me, and now you've chosen him?" Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. "I love him, Dad. It's not about you or Thomas. This is about me, about what I want." Her words hit William like a blow to the chest. Love. How could she speak of love for the son of the man who had caused him so much pain? It was unthinkable, unforgivable. His fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with the effort to hold back the storm that raged inside him. In that moment, something inside William broke. All the years of anger, all the bitterness toward Thomas Greer, and now the crushing weight of his daughter's betrayal boiled over. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his vision narrowing as the rage took full control. He no longer saw his daughter standing in front of him. All he saw was the betrayal, the defiance, the unbearable pain she had caused, And before he could stop himself, William lashed out. The sound of the slap echoed through the night, a harsh, resounding crack that seemed to hang in the air. Emily staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Michael moved toward her, but she held up her hand to stop him, her gaze fixed on her father in disbelief. "Dad, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. William stood frozen, staring at his hand in horror. For the briefest moment, the fog of rage lifted, and he saw what he had done. His daughter, his precious Emily, stood before him, tears streaming down her face, and the full weight of the moment crashed down on him. He had crossed a line that he could never uncross, but the moment of clarity was fleeting, snuffed out as quickly as it had come. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest provocation to explode again. And this time, the consequences would be far more devastating. The slap had done more than just leave a mark on Emily's face. It had shattered something much deeper. As her hand fell from her cheek, her eyes met her father's, and in that moment, William saw something that terrified him. Fear of him. It pierced through his crumbling resolve, cutting him to the core. The one person he had sworn to protect now looked at him as if he were the very monster he had always tried to shield her from. But the rage, his anger at Emily, at Michael, and at Thomas Greer, still burned within him. It bubbled just beneath the surface, threatening to consume him once again. He couldn't stand the sight of Emily standing beside Michael, the son of the man who had caused him so much suffering. "Get away from him," William growled, taking a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you're doing, Emily." Her voice trembled but remained steady. "No, Dad, you don't know. You don't understand. I love him, and that's not going to change because of some feud you've held on to for years. It's not about you and Thomas anymore. This is my life." My life. Those words hit William harder than any physical blow. For years, he had been the one in control, guiding her, protecting her, shielding her from the world. And now, in the heat of the moment, she was telling him that she was beyond his control, that she would make her own choices, even if they meant defying him in the worst possible way. Michael, sensing the danger, took a step forward, his voice calm but tense. "Mr. Parker, please. This doesn't have to be like this. I'm not my father. Emily and I—" The control William had fought so hard to maintain snapped in an instant. The years of bitterness, the weight of his unresolved grudge against Thomas Greer, and the betrayal he felt from his daughter all collided in a blinding storm of rage. His mind no longer registered his actions. In a blind fury, William lunged forward, shoving Michael with all his strength. Michael stumbled backward, barely keeping his balance as Emily screamed, rushing to his side. But William was quicker, his hands gripping Michael's shirt with a strength fueled by his anger. "You don't deserve her!" William shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. "You and your family don't deserve anything!" Michael struggled in William's grip, trying to break free, but William's rage gave him the strength of a man possessed. He raised his fist, ready to strike. But before he could land the blow, Emily was there, grabbing his arm, pulling him back with all the strength she could muster. "Dad, please!" she begged, her voice breaking with emotion. "Please, don't do this. This isn't you." But William couldn't hear her. He couldn't hear anything beyond the roaring in his head, the pounding of his heart, and the feeling of betrayal that coursed through his veins like fire. His world had narrowed to this single moment, this single act of violence. His need to destroy the person he believed had taken his daughter from him. In the struggle, as Emily tugged at his arm, something shifted. His grip on Michael slipped, and in a fleeting moment of chaos, William lost his balance. His foot caught on a loose stone, and as he stumbled forward, his hand instinctively reached for something to steady himself. His hand found a rock, small but heavy, its edges jagged, and before William could fully register what he was doing, he brought it down. The sound of the rock connecting with Michael's skull was sickening, a dull, wet thud that echoed through the clearing. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Michael crumpled to the ground, his body limp, blood beginning to pool beneath his head. Emily's scream tore through the night, a sound of pure primal horror. She dropped to her knees beside Michael, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the wound. desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. The damage was done. William stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hands still clutching the blood-stained rock. The fog of rage began to lift, replaced by the cold, stark realization of what he had done. His eyes widened in disbelief as he looked down at Michael's still body, the blood on his hands feeling like fire. He had killed him. Michael lay motionless on the ground, his face pale, his chest unmoving. Emily sobbed beside him, her hands slick with blood, her eyes wide with terror as she looked up at her father. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What have you done?" But William had no answer. He couldn't speak, couldn't process the horror of the moment. All he could do was stare at the lifeless body in front of him, at the blood on his hands, and feel the crushing weight of what he had done. Everything had changed. Everything was broken, and there was no going back. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Emily's sobs. She knelt beside Michael's lifeless body, her trembling hands pressing against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the blood. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both. For the first time in his life, William felt utterly powerless. The rage that had driven him had dissipated, leaving behind a cold emptiness that chilled him to his core. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he dropped the bloodied rock, staring at it as though it had suddenly burned him. His mind reeled, trying and failing to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. What have I done? The question echoed endlessly in his mind, but there were no answers. Only the cold, stark reality of Michael's body lying motionless at his feet. Emily's sobs grew louder, more desperate, as she cradled Michael's head in her lap, her tears falling onto his still pale face. She couldn't understand it either. Just moments ago, they had been together, talking, planning for a future that no longer existed. And now the man she loved was gone, taken from her in an instant by the one person she had always trusted the most. "Michael, please," she whispered through her tears, stroking his hair with trembling fingers, her voice breaking under the weight of her grief. "Please wake up." But there was no response. Michael's body remained still, lifeless, as the pool of blood beneath him grew larger. William stood frozen, rooted to the ground, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Emily's grief was unbearable to witness, but he couldn't look away. His mind was a storm of emotions, regret, shock, and a deep, gnawing guilt that he had never known before. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had only wanted to protect her, to stop her from making a mistake she would regret for the rest of her life. But now, as he stood there in the aftermath of his actions, he saw what he had truly done. He had taken away her future, her happiness, her love. He had destroyed everything, and there was no way to undo it. "Emily?" William's voice was barely a whisper, his throat dry, but she didn't hear him. She was too lost in her grief, too consumed by the horror of the moment. He tried again, stepping forward slightly. "Emily, Don't!" she snapped, her voice sharp and filled with a rage that cut through him like a knife. She looked up at him with eyes red and swollen from tears, her face streaked with grief and fury. "Don't you dare speak to me!" The venom in her voice pierced William deeper than any physical wound ever could. Emily's sobs quieted, but the anger in her eyes only grew stronger. Slowly, she laid Michael's head down on the ground and stood, facing her father with a look that made his blood run cold. Her grief had transformed into something darker now, something that mirrored the rage that had consumed him just moments earlier. "You killed him," she whispered, her voice steady but filled with venom. "You killed him, Dad, and I will never forgive you for that." The weight of her words crushed him. He had lost her. The daughter he had loved and protected for so long was gone, lost to the anger and pain he had caused. There was no going back, no fixing what he had done. He had destroyed everything, and now he would have to live with the consequences. Emily turned away from him, kneeling once more beside Michael's body. Her hands trembled as she wiped the blood from his face, her tears falling silently now, her grief too heavy for words. William watched helplessly, wanting to comfort her, to hold her like he had when she was a little girl, but he knew he couldn't. He was the cause of her pain, and any attempt to console her would only deepen the wound. Minutes dragged on, the air thick with the weight of death. The silence was unbearable, pressing down on William as he struggled to think, to understand what he could do next. But the answers eluded him. How could he fix this? How could he make up for what he had done? The truth was, he couldn't. And then, in the distance, the faint sound of sirens pierced the night. The sound grew louder, closer, and William realized with a sinking feeling that someone must have heard the commotion and called for help. The police were coming. Panic surged through him. What would he say? What could he say? The truth was too horrifying to admit, but the evidence was undeniable. The blood on his hands, the body at his feet. There was no escaping what he had done. But even as the sirens grew louder, even as the reality of his actions pressed down on him, William couldn't bring himself to run. He stood frozen, rooted to the spot by the crushing weight of his guilt. This was his fault. He had done this, and now he would have to face the consequences. As the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the clearing, William took one last look at Emily, still kneeling beside Michael, her face pale and tear-streaked. He wanted to say something, anything, to offer her comfort, to tell her he was sorry, but he knew it was too late. The only thing left to do now was to accept what was coming. The flashing lights of the police cars bathed the clearing in an eerie red and blue glow, casting long shadows across the ground. The wail of sirens faded, leaving only the heavy silence that followed the storm of emotions. The officers emerged from their vehicles, their expressions darkening as they took in the scene. Emily, broken and weeping beside Michael's lifeless body, and William, standing motionless, his hands and clothes stained with blood. "Step back," one of the officers ordered, his voice sharp and authoritative. But William didn't respond, barely registering the command. His mind was still lost in the fog of his actions, reeling from the irreversible damage he had caused. How did it come to this? The question echoed in his mind, but the weight of his guilt left no room for answers. Two officers moved quickly to Emily's side, their movements gentle as they tried to guide her away from Michael's body. She resisted at first, her hands clutching at his shirt, refusing to let go, but eventually she relented, her body limp and unresponsive, as though all the strength had drained from her. Her face was pale, her tear-streaked eyes blank and distant, as though her mind had shut down in an attempt to shield itself from the unbearable pain. "Miss, are you hurt?" one of the officers asked, his voice soft. But Emily didn't answer. Her body shook with silent sobs as she was led away, her gaze never leaving Michael's still form. Her world had collapsed in a single moment, and she was left shattered, broken in a way that nothing could mend. Meanwhile, William stood where he was, too numb to react as the remaining officers turned their attention to him. One of them, a tall man with a firm grip, approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. "Sir," the officer said, his voice even but firm, "I need you to step away from the body." William blinked, the officer's words slowly penetrating the haze in his mind. He looked down at Michael's body, at the blood still staining his hands, and took a shaky step backward. His throat was dry, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. "I didn't mean to—" The words sounded hollow even to him. The officer's expression remained neutral, though his eyes flickered with a kind of understanding that only came from years of witnessing tragedy. "Sir, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back." For a moment, William didn't move, his mind struggling to process the situation. He heard the officer's words, but they felt distant, as if they were coming from another world. His entire body felt heavy, as though the guilt that weighed him down had become a physical burden, crushing him under its weight. "Now," the officer repeated more forcefully this time, stepping closer. "Put your hands behind your back." It wasn't until the officer took another step forward that William finally complied. His movements were slow, hesitant, as if he were moving through thick, suffocating air. He felt the cold metal of the handcuffs clamp around his wrists, the sharp click of the lock sealing his fate. The sensation jolted him out of the fog, but only for a moment. His eyes drifted toward Emily, who was sitting on the ground, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her face buried in her hands. She wouldn't even look at him. The realization hit William like a punch to the gut. Not only had he taken a life, but he had also lost his daughter forever. It was more than guilt now. It was an overwhelming sense of finality. There was nothing he could say or do to change what had happened. No apology, no words of remorse could bring Michael back. Nothing could repair the shattered bond between him and Emily. "Why?" he muttered under his breath, barely audible. He didn't know if he was asking himself, the universe, or perhaps something deeper. Why had he let his anger spiral out of control? As the officers led him toward the waiting police car, his mind wandered back to the moment when he had first seen the message on Emily's phone. That moment, that single spark of discovery, had ignited the flames of rage inside him. If only he had taken a moment to breathe, to think, none of this would have happened. But it was too late now. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. The officers placed him in the back seat of the car, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud. The cold leather seat pressed against his back, and as the car began to pull away, William felt a deep, hollow emptiness settle over him. He stared out the window as the town of Millhaven passed by in a blur of streetlights and darkened houses. The town he had once called home, the place where he had built his life, now felt foreign, distant. In one reckless, unforgivable moment, he had lost everything. In the distance, he could still hear the sound of Emily's sobs as the officers led her away. The weight of her grief, her anger clung to him like a suffocating fog. He had destroyed her future, crushed her happiness, and shattered her trust. He had no one to blame but himself. The police car pulled into the station, and as the doors opened, the cold night air hit William's face, snapping him out of his daze. His legs felt weak as the officers led him inside, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. The booking process was brief, the officers efficient, but William hardly noticed. His mind was still back in the clearing, replaying the moment over and over, the sound of the rock connecting with Michael's skull echoing in his ears. As they placed him in a holding cell, the metal bars clanging shut behind him, the reality of his situation finally began to sink in. This was his life now, no longer the respected man of the town, no longer Emily's father. He was a murderer, a man whose hatred and pride had destroyed everything that mattered. He sank onto the hard, narrow bench, his head in his hands. The cold, sterile air of the cell did nothing to ease the torment that gnawed at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily, about the look in her eyes when she had told him she would never forgive him. He had lost her, just as surely as he had lost Michael. The weight of his actions settled over him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into despair. There was no escape from the consequences of what he had done, no undoing the damage, no taking back the moment of blind rage. In the distance, William could hear the faint hum of voices from the station, the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways. But inside his cell, there was only silence, an unbearable, crushing silence that mirrored the emptiness inside him. Days blurred into weeks, and before long, William's trial began. The town of Millhaven, once a place of quiet familiarity, was now abuzz with gossip and shock. The courtroom was filled with spectators, people who had once respected William, now eager to witness his fall from grace. The story of the father who had killed his daughter's lover had gripped the town, and everyone wanted to see the outcome. Emily sat in the front row, her face pale, her eyes empty of the warmth they had once held. She hadn't spoken to William since that night. She was there not for him, but for Michael, her love, whose life had been taken so brutally. Her presence was a constant reminder of what William had lost, and every time he glanced at her, he felt the crushing weight of his actions bearing down on him. The prosecution painted William as a man consumed by pride and hatred, whose long-standing feud with Thomas Greer had driven him to commit an unforgivable act. They laid out the facts of the case with precision. There was no denying what had happened. The evidence was clear. William had killed Michael in a fit of rage. The defense tried to argue that William had been overwhelmed, that his actions were driven by years of unresolved anger toward the Greers. They portrayed him as a man pushed to the brink, acting out of a father's misguided attempt to protect his daughter. But the jury's decision came swiftly. The facts were too damning, the loss too great. William was found guilty of second-degree murder. As the judge read out his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, William sat in silence. His eyes flicked once toward Emily, hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but her expression remained cold, distant. She wouldn't look at him. The daughter he had once cherished was lost to him, perhaps forever. When the trial was over, Emily left the courtroom without a word. William's heart ached as he watched her walk away, knowing he would never see her again, at least not as the father she once loved. His actions had destroyed not only her future with Michael, but also any chance of reconciliation. Prison was a slow, suffocating existence for William. The days stretched out, each one filled with the same crushing guilt. The walls of his cell closed in around him, leaving him with nothing but his thoughts of Emily, of Michael, and of the life he had thrown away in a moment of blind rage. The letters he sent to Emily remained unanswered. Every week he wrote to her, trying to explain, to express the depth of his sorrow and regret. He begged for her forgiveness, though deep down he knew it might never come. His words were filled with remorse, but he couldn't expect Emily to read them or even care. She had moved on, left Millhaven, and built a life far from the shadow of his crime. As the years passed, William grew older, his body weakening, his mind weighed down by the unrelenting burden of what he had done. He lived in a perpetual state of regret, reliving the moment that had shattered his world. He would never forgive himself for taking Michael's life or for destroying Emily's trust in him. Then one day a letter arrived. It was from Emily. His hands trembled as he opened it, afraid of what it might contain. The letter was short, only a few lines, but those words were enough to bring tears to his eyes. "I can't forgive you, Dad. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to move on, and I hope somehow you can too." It wasn't the forgiveness he had longed for, but it was something that gave him a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, William allowed himself to cry, not out of rage or sorrow, but out of the faint hope that one day Emily might find a way to heal, and maybe in time, so would he. As he sat alone in his cell, the quiet weight of his actions still pressing down on him, William knew that his life would never be what it once was. But perhaps with Emily's letter, there was a small chance for redemption, a chance to find peace in the midst of the wreckage he had caused.